At the dawn of recorded history, there existed a class of men and women who held unparalleled power over the Celtic world. This is the story of the Druids, a tale of wisdom, mystery, and a legacy that refuses to be forgotten. Today, the word druid conjures images of wizened sages in white robes, guardians of nature's secrets and wielders of ancient magic. They appear in our books, our films, and even in modern spiritual movements. But who were the Druids really? The true Druids were far more complex and in many ways more fascinating than popular culture would have us believe. They were the intellectual elite of ancient Celtic society, priests, judges, advisors, and keepers of tradition. Yet for all their importance, much of what we think we know about them is clouded by myth and misconception. From Ireland to Turkey, the Druids held sway over Celtic peoples for centuries. They left no written records of their own, yet their influence was so great that Greek and Roman writers couldn't help but take notice, sometimes with awe, sometimes with fear. For the purpose of discovering the truth, we'll peel back the layers of history so that we may learn their origins, their practices, their downfall, and their enduring legacy. Perhaps if we can separate fact from fiction, we can discover why these ancient figures continue to captivate us so deeply, even to this day. Our story begins over 2,000 years ago, in a Europe very different from the one we know today. A Europe where the Druids were about to emerge from the mists of prehistory and into the light of recorded history. To understand the Druids, we must first understand the world that gave birth to them. Around 500 BCE, much of Europe was dominated by diverse groups we now call the Celts. These were not a unified people, but a mosaic of tribes sharing similar languages, artistic styles, and religious beliefs. From Ireland to Turkey, Celtic culture flourished, marked by intricate artwork, advanced metalworking, and complex social structures. It was in this rich cultural soil that the Druids took root, but pinpointing their exact origins proves challenging. The earliest known reference to Druids comes from Greek texts dating to around 300 BCE, where they are simply referred to as the Celts or Holy Ones. These texts, now lost but quoted by later writers, speak of philosophers who preached in riddles, bidding men to reverence the gods. But the Druids may have existed long before this first written mention. Even the word druid holds clues to their nature. It likely comes from the Proto-Celtic roots deru, meaning oak, and wid, to know. The Druids, it seems, were those who know the oak, or perhaps more broadly, those who possessed knowledge of nature and the divine. This connection to oak trees wasn't merely linguistic. Classical writers like Pliny the Elder described Druid rituals involving oak groves and mistletoe, a plant that grows on oak trees. These accounts paint a picture of a priesthood deeply connected to the natural world. But the Druids were far more than nature priests. As we'll discover, they held a unique and powerful position in Celtic society, one that would eventually bring them into conflict with the expanding Roman Empire. As Celtic society flourished, so too did the influence of the Druids. This was their golden age, a time when Druidic knowledge and power reached its peak. Everywhere in Gaul, there are only two classes of men who are of any account or consideration. The two privileged classes are the Druids and the Knights. They were the intellectual elite of Celtic society, filling roles that in our world would be separated among religious leaders, judges, scientists, and advisors to kings. At the heart of their power was their religious role. Druids were the intermediaries between the people and their gods. They conducted sacrifices, interpreted omens, and ensured the proper observance of sacred rites. But their influence extended far beyond the spiritual realm. Caesar reported that Druids also acted as judges, mediating disputes between individuals and even entire tribes. Their judgments carried immense weight, backed by the ultimate sanction of excommunication from religious rites, a punishment that could render an individual a pariah in Celtic society. The Druids officiate at the worship of the gods, regulate public and private sacrifices, and give rulings on all religious questions. They act as judges in practically all disputes, whether between tribes or between individuals. What's clear is that at their height, Druids wielded enormous influence in Celtic society. But this very power would soon bring them into conflict with an expanding empire that saw them as a threat, as the Golden Age of the Druids was about to face its greatest challenge yet. But before we dive into this conflict, it serves us best to understand exactly why the Roman Empire saw them as such a threat. And to that end, let us take a deeper look into their philosophies and rituals. Exposing the beliefs and philosophies of Druids proves to be a most difficult task. While they left no written records of their own, accounts from classical writers help us catch glimpses into their world. At the heart of Druidic philosophy lay a powerful belief in the immortality of the soul. Julius Caesar wrote that they taught a form of reincarnation, where the soul passes from one body to another upon death. This concept, reminiscent of Pythagorean ideas, likely contributed to the renowned fearlessness of Celtic warriors in battle. A lesson which they take particular pains to inculcate is that the soul does not perish, but after death passes from one body to another. They think that this is the best incentive to bravery, because it teaches men to disregard the terrors of death. This reverence for the eternal was mirrored in the Druids' deep connection to the natural world. Pliny the Elder described their particular veneration of oak trees and mistletoe. He detailed an elaborate ritual where Druids would harvest mistletoe using a golden sickle, carefully catching it in a white cloak before it could touch the ground. The ceremony would culminate in the sacrifice of 2 white bulls, binding the physical and spiritual realms. The Druids' attention to nature extended beyond the earth to the heavens above. Caesar tells us they were keen observers of celestial movements, studying the movements of stars, the properties of plants, and what classical writers referred to as natural philosophy, the nature of the universe itself. This melding of the cosmic and the earthly was characteristic of the Druids' holistic worldview. They also hold long discussions about the heavenly bodies and their movements, the size of the universe and of the earth, the physical constitution of the world, and the power and properties of the gods, and they instruct the young men in all these subjects. The path to becoming a Druid was long and arduous. Caesar wrote that training could take up to 20 years, with students required to memorize vast amounts of knowledge. This oral tradition was jealously guarded. Druids forbade the writing down of their teachings, believing it would diminish their power. It is said that these pupils have to memorize a great number of verses, so many that some of them spend 20 years at their studies. Divination formed another crucial aspect of Druidic practice. Classical sources describe them interpreting omens from various natural phenomena, from the flight patterns of birds to the behavior of animals. Through these practices, Druids claimed to bridge the gap between the mortal and divine worlds. Yet not all accounts of Druidic practices were benign. Strabo claimed that the Druids engaged in human sacrifice, sometimes using a structure called a wicker man. However, we must approach these accounts with caution, considering the potential biases of Roman writers against cultures they sought to conquer. We are told of still other kinds of human sacrifices. For example, they would shoot victims to death with arrows, or impale them in the temples, or, having devised a colossus of straw and wood, throw into the colossus cattle and wild animals of all sorts and human beings, and then make a burnt offering of the whole thing. The beliefs and practices of the Druids set them apart as a unique and powerful force in Celtic society. However, as we'll explore in the coming chapters, the clash between Druidic traditions and Roman ambitions would reshape the cultural landscape of ancient Europe. As Rome's power extended into the Celtic lands, the Druids faced their greatest challenge. Their influence and beliefs put them on a collision course with the expanding empire. The conflict began in earnest with Julius Caesar's conquest of Gaul in the 50s BCE. Caesar saw the Druids as a unifying force among the Gallic tribes, a potential threat to Roman rule. Indeed, the Druids played a significant role in resisting Roman invasion. Classical sources tell us they could stop battles by intervening between armies, and they encouraged Celtic warriors to fight against Roman occupation. But it was under Emperor Augustus, in the late 1st century BCE, that systematic suppression of the Druids began. Augustus banned Roman citizens from participating in Druidic practices. This suppression reached its peak under Emperor Claudius in the 1st century CE. Claudius banned Druidism entirely throughout the empire. The Roman author Suetonius wrote that Claudius abolished the barbarous and inhuman religion of the Druids among the Gauls. Perhaps the most vivid account of this clash comes from the Roman historian Tacitus. He described the Roman attack on the island of Anglesey, off the coast of Wales, in 60 CE. Anglesey was a stronghold of Druidic power, and Tacitus painted a striking picture of Druids calling down curses upon the Roman invaders. On the shore stood the opposing army with its dense array of armed warriors, while between the ranks dashed women, in black attire like the Furies, with hair dishevelled, waving brands. All around, the Druids, lifting up their hands to heaven and pouring forth dreadful imprecations, scared our soldiers by their unfamiliar sight, so that, as if their limbs were paralyzed, they stood motionless and exposed to wounds. Faced with Roman persecution, Druidism went underground. Some Druids may have fled to Ireland, which remained outside Roman control. Others may have adapted their practices to survive in secret. By the 2nd century CE, Druids had largely disappeared from the historical record in Roman-controlled areas. The old ways were suppressed, supplanted by Roman religious practices and eventually Christianity. The clash with Rome marked the end of Druidism as a dominant force in Celtic society. But as we are about to uncover, echoes of Druidic traditions would survive in folklore, literature, and perhaps even in secretive practices long after the Roman conquest. As the Roman Empire faded and the Dark Ages descended upon Europe, one might think the Druids had vanished entirely. But traces of their legacy lingered, echoing through the centuries in unexpected ways. In Ireland, untouched by Roman conquest, elements of Druidic tradition may have survived longer. Irish monks, as they began to write down their native legends in the Christian era, preserved tales of Druids in their manuscripts. In these stories, Druids often appear as powerful sorcerers and advisors to kings. The legendary Cathbad, Druid to King Concobar in the Ulster cycle, is said to have possessed the gift of prophecy. Another tale speaks of the druid Mug Ruith, so powerful he could change the seasons and raise the dead. In Wales, too, druids featured in medieval literature. The word dryu in Middle Welsh came to mean seer. The famous bard Taliesin, in poems attributed to him, claims druidic knowledge and powers. Intriguingly, some early Christian saints' lives contain accounts of confrontations with druids. St. Patrick, for instance, is said to have faced off against the druids of the Irish High King at Tara, outdoing their magic with the power of Christian faith. These accounts suggest that elements of druidic tradition survived, at least in cultural memory, well into the Christian era. Some scholars even speculate that certain druidic practices may have been absorbed into early Celtic Christianity. Moreover, roles once filled by druids, as healers, advisors and judges, continued to be important in medieval society. While no longer called druids, these figures may have carried on some of the old traditions. It's important to note that these medieval accounts are far removed from the historical druids of the pre-Roman era. They're colored by centuries of cultural change, Christian influence, and the lens of legend, yet they show how the image of the druid continued to captivate the imagination long after their supposed disappearance. As the Age of Enlightenment dawned in Europe, a renewed interest in ancient cultures sparked a rediscovery of the druids. This revival would dramatically reshape perceptions of these ancient priests, often in ways that had more to do with imagination than historical fact. The revival began in earnest with John Aubrey in the 17th century. Aubrey was the first to connect the druids with ancient stone monuments like Stonehenge, an idea that captured the public imagination despite lacking historical evidence. This notion was popularized by William Stukeley in the 18th century. Stukeley's vivid illustrations of druids performing rituals at Stonehenge helped cement this association in the public mind, even though we now know Stonehenge predates the druids by thousands of years. In Wales, the druids took on new life through the work of Iolo Morgannwg. In the late 18th century, Morgannwg claimed to have discovered ancient druidic traditions, which he incorporated into the Gorsedd, a gathering of bards that continues to this day. We now know much of Edward Williams' work was inventive fabrication, but its impact on Welsh culture was profound. This revival also saw the birth of Neo-Druidism. Groups like the Ancient Order of Druids, founded in 1781, sought to recreate druidic practices based on their romantic interpretations of the past. These early Neo-Druids were more akin to fraternal orders than religious groups, focusing on philosophy, mutual aid, and a romanticized Celtic heritage. The Romantic revival of Druidism bore little resemblance to the historical Druids of ancient Gaul and Britain, yet it profoundly shaped popular perceptions of the Druids, creating an enduring image that continues to influence how we think about these ancient priests today. This reimagining set the stage for both scholarly reappraisal and new spiritual movements in the centuries to come. As we entered the 20th century, our understanding of the ancient Druids began to change dramatically. Modern archaeology and critical scholarship started to separate fact from centuries of fiction and romanticism. Archaeologists like Stuart Pigott and Anne Ross brought new rigor to the study of Celtic societies. Their work, along with advances in archaeological techniques, began to paint a more nuanced picture of the world in which the Druids lived. Discoveries like Lindo Man, a well-preserved bog body found in England in 1984, provided tangible evidence of ancient Celtic practices. While academia was reassessing the ancient Druids, Neo-Druidism was evolving into a modern spiritual movement. Groups like the Order of Bards, Ovates and Druids, founded in 1964, sought to create a nature-based spirituality inspired by what they saw as Druidic wisdom. Today, Neo-Druidism encompasses a wide range of practices and beliefs. Some groups focus on reconstructing ancient Celtic religions, while others blend Druidic concepts with modern environmental and spiritual concerns. Despite having little direct connection to the ancient Druids, these groups have kept the Druidic name alive in popular culture. The image of the Druid continues to captivate the public imagination, appearing in books, films, and games. But these popular depictions often owe more to 19th century Romanticism than to historical reality. Modern scholarship has revealed a gap between the historical Druids and their popular image. The real Druids were not the white-robed sages of Stonehenge, but a complex priesthood deeply embedded in Iron Age Celtic society. Their true practices and beliefs remain in many ways as mysterious to us as they were to the Romans 2,000 years ago. As we conclude our exploration of Druidic history, we find ourselves in a world where their legacy continues to evolve and captivate. In our modern era, faced with environmental crises and a growing disconnect from nature, many find resonance in the popular image of Druids as guardians of the natural world. While this image may not reflect historical reality, it speaks to very real contemporary concerns. In popular culture, Druids remain a potent symbol of ancient wisdom and mystical power. From fantasy literature to Hollywood blockbusters, the romanticized image of the Druid continues to fire our imagination. Modern Neo-Druidism has grown into a diverse global movement. While it may bear little resemblance to ancient Druidic practices, it represents a sincere attempt to reconnect with nature and find spiritual meaning in an increasingly technological world. The gap between the historical Druids and their modern image reminds us of the power of cultural memory and reimagining. The Druids have been repeatedly reinvented over the centuries, each time reflecting the needs and values of the society doing the reimagining. So, why do the Druids continue to fascinate us? Perhaps it's because they represent a connection to our distant past, a reminder of ancient wisdom we fear we've lost. Or maybe it's because the image of the Druid, wise, connected to nature, standing against the tide of empire, resonates with our own desires and anxieties in the modern world. Whatever the reason, the story of the Druids is far from over. From the misty groves of ancient Gaul to the pages of modern fantasy, from archaeological digs to Neo-Druid ceremonies, the Druids continue to evolve in our cultural imagination. They remain what they have always been, a mirror in which we see reflected our own quest for wisdom, our connection to the natural world, and our endless fascination with the mysteries of the past.